Hi, y'all. I'm Jeff Crow. I am the UX researcher on the growth team. And today I'm going to be talking about some research that we did around the navigation of GitLab, specifically focusing on, at a high level, what are some of our major issues and opportunities as they relate to navigation. So the genesis of this is that we in growth had an OKR around navigation, specifically to propose designs for 2 improvements to navigation and identify 10 others for the backlog. Basically, we have quite a large backlog of issues related to navigation going back years in some cases. And we didn't quite know exactly how to prioritize that or what was sort of the most pressing of those issues. And so some of this research was done in order to just understand, of all sort of the known problems that we have, what are the largest opportunities for us, or what are the most pressing needs for our users when it comes to navigation. And so given that we had this OKR actually came a little bit into the quarter. um, and so we didn't have a tremendous amount of time, and so we had to sort of be scrappy and think really tactically of what we could execute in a given time frame. So why navigation? Navigation is a really persistent issue for us at GitLab. It's been something that comes up very often in sentiment surveying that we do, NPS and SUS. You can see some of the examples here on the right. These are verbatims from either our NPS or SUS speaking to issues that are related to navigation. And then the thing I always sort of come back to is navigation is really one of the only aspects of GitLab that literally every user touches. And so if you think about making changes and improvements, even small changes and improvements, when you aggregate those across the entirety of the user base, those gains in efficiency or gains in sentiment in terms of making things easier or more pleasurable to use are just massive. And so I think it's really important to try to make our navigation as easy to use and as efficient as it can be, because in terms of just gains for our users, it's just going to be huge. And so, like I said, we didn't have a tremendous amount of time. We had approximately 6 weeks before the end of the quarter, and thus when this OKR would need to be wrapped up. And so, given that amount of time, we really chose to sort of look at the ends of the spectrum when it comes to usage of navigation and the people that use navigation. And so, if you think about that as a spectrum, that's basically, people who are brand new to GitLab, what you would call net new users who have never used GitLab before and are not currently sort of involved in an organization or group that's using GitLab. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have basically highly active users of GitLab, people using GitLab more than 3 days a week, people who ideally have sort of established routines and workflows that we wanted to understand better. So for the new users, we really wanted to understand, when you're brand new to GitLab and you have really no mental model, you really have no background to go off of, how does navigation affect your understanding of the product, and how are you able to comprehend that navigation and complete what we considered introductory tasks that would be appropriate for someone who is brand new to GitLab. So you can think of this as things like creating a new issue, creating an issue board, modifying your profile, adding someone to a group. These are not kind of detail focused tasks like, creating and editing a CI pipeline or going deep into, maybe roadmaps, things that, are going to happen certainly, but are going to happen once you're a bit more established in GitLab. And then for the active users and routines, active user routines and workflows, this was much more open-ended. We really wanted to understand for these folks, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis? Kind of how we framed it was like, when you first enter GitLab for the day, like what are the first things you're doing? What information are you looking for? How are you accessing that information? And sort of what is your goal, and what are the kind of workflows that you've established to do these sort of common tasks that you're doing every day, whether that's looking into MRs, dealing with issues, whatever that may be. And so that was really led by the participants themselves and the work they were doing in their GitLab account. And so it varied much more compared to the new user experience, which was tasks that we formulated for folks just to see how easily they would be able to complete those tasks, or potentially not easily. So for the new user component of this testing, given that we wanted to get a decent sample size, we wanted approximately, anywhere from 10 to 15 people. And we didn't want to put people through all of the tasks, but we still wanted to have a large number of tasks, 10 tasks. Um, I created a unmoderated testing setup, and I know a lot of folks on the UX team are very interested in unmoderated testing. It's something we're talking a lot about. So I wanted to spend a moment talking about the setup that I used, because we did have some hiccups in the beginning and some kinks to work out, but it actually did end up working out pretty well for this purpose. And so what I did was created a Qualtrics survey that basically started with the instructions for how people should go about, completing the test, and basically instructed them to join a Zoom meeting, which they were the only member of that Zoom meeting. The purpose of that Zoom meeting was just to record them interacting with both the survey and the GitLab instance. Um, and so the survey would sort of instruct them as how to do that. It would gather the information we needed. It would tell them how to, download, share their screen, share their video, log into the GitLab instance. And then it had a randomized set of tasks for them to complete. And this was a nice usage of the Qualtrics survey logic, because you can basically use what's called a randomizer. And out of the 10 tasks that we created, each participant was presented with a set of 5 randomized tasks. And this is nice because with task-based testing, especially when you're using sort of a single interface where people keep going back to the same interface to complete new tasks, there's going to be a learning effect. So the last task the person completes is likely going to be easier for them than the first task. And so it's really important that for each person, you randomize those tasks such that the third task on your list, for instance, maybe for some people will be the first task they complete, for other people it will be the last task they complete. But once you have enough folks, that learning effect sort of gets distributed across each of them. And you don't have this issue where, oh, the last task on your list is always the last task people are going to perform as part of their study. And so they're always going to perform better on it than they might have with the first task. And so this randomizer that Qualtrics has was really nice for this purpose. And so basically the survey would present them with a task. You can see here, this was a really basic one, changing the name on your account. They were instructed to sort of complete this task, narrate their thought process as they went through it, complete it as best they could. If they felt like they couldn't, they could abandon it and they could come back. And then this survey asked them a couple questions once they either completed the task or felt they were unable to, just about, yes, I was able to, no, I wasn't, ask about their confidence, and then talk about how confident or how their confidence was compared to when they started the task. So the idea of how confident did you feel when you started, and then how did that relate to how you feel once you actually went through it? And that's nice because you sort of get the delta of how easy they felt a task should be versus how easy it actually was when they did it. And the actual values here weren't super useful, but what was really valuable here was having them talk through each of these answer choices. And of course, all this was on the recording. And so as people would go and answer these questions, they talk through why they answered a given response and what led them to do that. And they were instructed to do that. And so that was really valuable, just hearing, oh, I expected this to be really easy, but it was very difficult for these reasons. Or I expected this to be very easy. It was very easy. Great. So this actually worked out really well. There were some kinks that we still need to work out. People cannot take these unmoderated tests in parallel. Only one person can do it at a time, unfortunately, just due to how Zoom works. And I realized only after interrupting one of my poor participants and knocking him out of his session that I cannot host a meeting while one of these participants is doing one of these sessions, because I am technically the host of these meetings. And so these are all solvable problems. I feel like if we were to use this in the future, these are things that we can definitely address in future iterations, but it was definitely a bit of a learning experience for me. So I just want to go into some of the findings that we found from both of these sessions, and then later on I'll go into the next steps that we're going to do as a result of what we uncovered. So one of the big things I think was, in terms of the groups that we're showing people and the groups that people are members of, typically people described being actively using maybe 1 or 2 groups at most, but often they had 3 to 4 times that many groups in their groups list. And especially if this was their dashboard, this is something they were coming to every time they log in, and this was sort of their root homepage of GitLab. And we do have sorting mechanisms for that group to try to float the most relevant things to the top, but they weren't super useful for people because the sorting mechanisms aren't necessarily personal to the individual. they're about the group as a whole. And so, for instance, someone showed me a group that was basically the second group in their ranking, and they said, I haven't looked in this group in a year and a half. But other people were using that group on a nearly daily basis. And so the activity by those other people kept popping that group back up to the top of this person's group list. And it basically gave it an air of importance that for him did not exist. And so I think it was really interesting to hear that, like, oh yeah, I have all these groups, they're technically active groups, but for my own purposes, they're considered deprecated or archived. These are words that people were using. These are old groups. But in terms of how we showed them in the interface, they were just as important as the one or two groups people were interacting with on a nearly daily basis. The other thing, when it comes to navigating, groups and projects, and typically the workflows that the active users would describe was, oh, I have a handful of projects or groups that I care about that I monitor typically every day or multiple times a week. How they were then getting to those groups was navigating through the tree structure of GitLab groups and projects. And so if you think about our user interface, you start at a high level of a group, you then potentially navigate down to a subgroup, and then down to a project, and then within a project, whatever aspect you care about, whether that's MRs or pipelines or issues or whatever. And basically each time people needed to get to a different project, they had that kind of ping pong up and down in order to do this. So they would start at the dashboard, they would go down to an individual project, then they would go back up to the dashboard, they would navigate back down into an individual project, and back and forth and back and forth. And they really described this as kind of labor intensive. One phrase someone used was, everything in GitLab feels very detached from everything else, in that it feels like those objects or those entities within GitLab are far apart, and that there's a lot of clicking or effort that has to happen to go from one to the next. And kind of what we saw, and what even some people were able to articulate, was they want to be able to move horizontally, if you will, across projects, even if those projects maybe span different groups, or are not necessarily closely related. And this was difficult in our UI, and people kind of just had to put in the effort to do this manually. So another big finding, we have these frequently visited units in the top nav for both projects and groups. For almost everyone we spoke to, these were just empty. And again, remember, these are very active users of GitLab. These are people using GitLab more than 3 days a week. And also keep in mind that as we spoke to people, they were navigating all through their GitLab instance and clicking on groups and projects as we were talking. And so even by the end of these sessions, you would expect, had they never used GitLab before, just that navigating during the session would have populated these units. And in almost every case, it wasn't. And so we've been talking with engineering about why potentially this is happening. From what I understand, it has to do with the fact that we store this data in local storage in the browser, and that has some issues. It doesn't cross machines, but also I think maybe the recency of it is affected by this as well. For the few folks where we did see content being populated in this, it really wasn't what they felt was recently visited. And it really didn't provide value to them, in that, like, it wasn't the things they needed to access. And that may have been just due to the limited sort of real estate here. I think typically between, 4 to 5 items show up here. And so it just, maybe there were more than 4 or 5 items they cared about. And so it just, the things they cared about weren't necessarily included in that list. And then one of the kind of big findings, and actually positive findings, from the new user study that we did was, while there certainly was some difficulty and some confusion completing those introductory tasks, almost everyone was able to complete almost every task. There were very, very few instances where these brand new users to GitLab were just unable to complete a task. And I think that was really positive, and actually a really great learning for us, because it actually helps sort of direct our effort into where we need to spend our time, and where maybe larger problems do exist. And the problems that we did uncover as part of that study were pretty minor and actionable. So one of the things that we discovered, this unit here, and I don't know what this unit is called in pajamas terms. I tried to look it up, and I couldn't find it. But one of the major problems that new users had with this button is that this is both a button and a drop down, and people expected that when they were to click one of the items in this dropdown, that would trigger the action that it's describing. And that's not actually the case. there's a second click required. So if I were to click, for instance, new subgroup, the button state would change. It would become a new subgroup button. I would then have to click new subgroup in the button itself to execute that action. And so multiple users had this thing where they said, okay, new subgroup, they clicked it, they kind of waited a beat expecting there to be a transition. Nothing would happen. And then they'd say, oh, and they'd maybe click the drop down again. They'd look at it. And then eventually they'd say, oh, okay. And they'd click the button and they'd be on their way. But there was this sort of moment of confusion for folks where they really did expect the click on the drop down to be the click that would execute that action. But again, this is something actionable. This is something that we can address. This is something. It's not a major issue, which was really great to see, especially for the brand new user. So next steps based on what we found in this research. So in terms of product improvements, kind of the big ones are fixing frequently visited. Our first step in terms of an MVC is just let's make the unit work as it's intended to work. We do have some plans to potentially revisit it from a design perspective and rethink the concept, but our first step is just, we have a unit that's meant to show you frequently visited projects and groups. Let's actually allow it to accomplish that goal. The other thing that we're doing is going to be instrumenting the top bar navigation. So unfortunately, right now, we do not have any instrumentation on, as far as I know, any of our navigation elements, which makes it a bit challenging to understand the relative frequency of usage of those elements and understand just at an aggregate level what aspects of the navigation folks are using. So the expansion team is going to be putting in work to instrument at least the top bar navigation so we can get a better idea of usage. And that'll help inform some of the next research that we do as well. The things that we want to investigate in terms of research for this quarter, one aspect is dashboard redesign, prototype testing. Something we heard a lot was that the homepage or the dashboard is not terribly useful for folks. As I was saying, it's not showing people the information that's pertinent to them. It's showing people sort of everything. And whether that's all your projects, all your groups, all your activity, it's not the things I care about as an individual. Now, what I care about as an individual is a very complex problem that's very specific to the individual. So it's not that we have a very easy solution that we can put in place that'll solve everything for everyone. So we need to try to better understand what is important to an individual and how can we frame that and how can we show that information in a way that will work for a variety of people in a variety of situations. So how we're hoping to accomplish that, we're still kind of early on in how we're formulating this, is doing some rapid iterative prototype testing. So using small prototypes of potentially even individual components that could live in that space to, of course, validate those as potential solutions, but also use those as sort of a jumping off point for larger conversations around what type of information is relevant to you? What would you want to see here? How does this relate to what you're doing in your work and the information that's relevant to you? So sort of a combination problem and solution validation. And ideally doing this sort of very rapidly such that we're potentially even doing rounds of these tests as often as once a week. Such that we can get to a place very early on where we can feel reasonably confident that we've got a solution at a conceptual level that will work, and then we can go and put in the design work to really flesh it out and then test out that fleshed out solution. And then the other area that we want to investigate for research is new users and established groups. And so as I said, net new users, people who are brand new and not really associated with a larger organization, they tend to do pretty well with basic introductory tasks. And so we want to shift our focus from those folks to people who are new users, but coming into an established organization or group, because they're going to have much more existing content to interact with. They're going to potentially have much larger, more complex tasks they need to complete. And we think that's really where there's probably a lot of things we can address. It also is nice because it aligns with the goals of growth in terms of expansion and increasing activity and increasing seat count. And so it's where we want to try to focus more of our time and make sure we're serving those users well. All right, that's it for me. If anybody has any questions about unmoderated testing or this navigation work, please feel free to reach out to me, or you can ping the navigation channel on Slack. And yeah, thanks for having me.